Hi, my name is Jon Hansen. I am the founder and chief editor of Procurement Insights blog. Now, listen, I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'd love to be. However, if you need to reach me in any way, shape, or form, my contact coordinates are at the last slide in this presentation, or I can make it easier for you. All you have to do is go to Google search and type in Procurement Insights, and I'm usually the first or second one to pop up. Anyway, welcome to today's presentation. It's a 30-minute session. Supplier management during a crisis, moving collaboration beyond a nice sentiment. Now, I want to get right to it because, again, we have a compressed time of 30 minutes. So over to the left, you'll notice on the slide, I have four pieces of the pie, so to speak. I'm going to talk about a loss of trust, Frito-Lay. I'm going to talk about contracting in the construction industry. If it's not broken, then fix it. The I-35W Story, a success built on a crisis, and Facebook's innovative early pay plan. Now, all of this encompasses what does it mean to move collaboration beyond a nice sentiment. And I think that's really a key point of what I want you to come away with for each of these case studies. And that's the important point. They're all case studies. They're all designed to point you in a certain direction of where you can verify and confirm how to lay a framework to be successful, especially during times of uncertainty. Now, one of the things that's I think is probably key is I'm going to start right off the bat with the Lay story, and I call it the shelf story. And as you can see, on one side, there's a full shelf, fully stocked, and the other one's an empty shelf, but not perhaps for the reason you think. One of the things that came out from an article written by Dawn Terra of SIG, she's the CEO, titled The Inflated Supply Chain, is that strained relationships between buyers and sellers due to inflation are making headlines around the globe. Now, I want to qualify this. Inflation is one part of it. Another side of it is shrinkflation. I'm not sure if many of you have heard of it, but the reality is that instead of raising prices, suppliers are cutting back on the size of their products. Again, that's a talk for another day, but they have both equal effects to certain degrees. Anyway, so the relationships are strained, and perhaps you can even relate to that a little bit in terms of your own relationships with suppliers. Let's put it this way. You're not alone. Canada's biggest food manufacturer, PepsiCo, Frito-Lay, and we're all familiar with the Frito-Lay brand, is no longer shipping its products to its largest grocer, and I'm talking about Loblaws, which is a massive chain here in Canada. Now, what it is it's how inflation is impacting the industry and driving a wedge between retailers and suppliers. However, is this wedge something new because of inflation, or is this wedge always existed? Let's go back in history a little bit. I'm going to throw an extra bonus coverage to you in a case reference. In a pickle. What am I talking about? Remember, Walmart is a big retailer. And this is a story going back to 2000, 2007 period. In fact, I wrote about this in an article in 2007. And the Vlasic Pickles was begging Walmart for relief on the pricing pressure. You know, they want to increase the cost of a jar of pickles. Now, to give you some context, and I'll get into it in detail, is that the gallon jar of what consumers were paying at Walmart for a gallon, they were paying at other stores for the same Vlasic pickles, but in a small jar. So you can see the disconnect there because they're getting killed. Number one, they're not making money. Number two, they're limited to what they can do relative to other retailers, obviously, because if the price goes down for a gallon with Walmart, what do you think that's going to do to their other relationships? So it was a clear threat that Walmart made when Vlasic Pickles pushed back and said, look, we need a break. We just want to raise it even a little bit. And Walmart said, if you do that, we are not going to buy any of your products. So they're kind of stuck in the middle there. Now, it's an interesting story because, again, they agreed to sell a gallon jar of pickles for an absurdly cheap price. Let's face it, Walmart had the leverage, the weight, and the capability to do these things. And as I mentioned earlier, why would consumers buy a small jar for $3 when you get a gallon for the same price? The margin was so low, but Walmart insisted to hold the price point. Otherwise, their product would be off the shelves. Finally, after a certain amount of time, Walmart let Vlasic off the hook, so to speak, and said, yes, you can finally raise the price or lower the price, whatever you need to do to make it competitive. And that there's not, they can't get consumers can't get the gallon jar for the same price as the small jar. But however difficult that was, to maybe give up that ground, it didn't help Vlasic too much, because Vlasic ended up going bankrupt in January 2001 because of the Vlasic pickle scenario. Now, this is an important point to remember here. There was no crisis situation. There was no inflationary consideration. There wasn't any issues of what you can call the pandemic, a global pandemic interrupting supply chain. It was purely might of volume controlling the supply relationship that led to the bankruptcy of Vlasic Pickles. So I want you to keep that in mind now. This wasn't during a crisis. Does this wedge exist before? Did it exist before the pandemic hit? Did it exist before we're now in this position of where we have to start cooperating with suppliers? Trouble is, how did the Lay's and Loblaw story end? I mean, how do you, against that backdrop and practices such as that, which is commonplace, how do you, against that backdrop, find a way to suddenly collaborate and communicate? Well, you know what? I wish I could say that it was a exciting and an example story between Loblaws and Lay's, PepsiCo. But one of the things that made it unique is that it gave us an inner working for the first time into the degree of negotiation and what goes on between buyers and sellers. The only thing that really changed it dramatically from the everyday business is it had never been so public and never featured two large industry giants of equal size and, I guess, willingness to play chicken to go ahead and call each other's bluff. Loblaw frames a situation that, look, even though Lay's is saying, you know, we're getting killed by freight, we're getting killed by increasing costs and all these other elements because we're in a post-pandemic world and the supply chains haven't completely recovered. They looked at it and said, no, we think the suppliers try to just get more money and capitalize on a situation to sort of, build up their own coffers. And we had to have a difficult discussion with them. And that's why Lay's pulled the product off the shelf. Remember the empty shelves there. Now, the situation here was interesting, is that it's not uncommon for a supplier to cut off a retailer during a price dispute. However, again, this standoff dragged on for so long and it was so public, something had to be done. Now, the government, what they did is they drafted a code or began drafting a code of conduct that would implement new rules of engagement between suppliers and buyers, new negotiating rules. And they said in the article, and this was in the Financial Post, that PepsiCo and Loblaw will find themselves back at a negotiating table together. Well, sure enough, they did. But here's the thing. They didn't disclose how that deal was reached. In other words, it's not clear who blinked. And I don't like to think of negotiations and relationships with suppliers as being a zero-sum game, especially during a crisis, based upon somebody being a loser and somebody being a winner. However, both parties refused to discuss it. However, they did confirm that it was mutually resolved. Although, as the representative from PepsiCo put it, the Frito-Lay brand, is that it was the last 2 months were one of the most challenging times they had experienced. So if you look at that resolution, the thing that raises in my mind is, was that really a resolution? Was it forced to come to the table? What damage did it do to the relationship going forward? And how much of our negotiation and relationship with suppliers today are based upon the Walmart model or a similar thinking line of holding your cards close to your vest? And I'll talk about Tim Cummings from used to be IACCM, who once wrote an article saying that when it comes to being around the negotiating table, all parties lie to each other about what they can do, by when they can do it, and for how much. So just keep that in mind. What's the background towards management, supplier management during a crisis? How do you transition it from where it has been to where we need it to go? Now, again, the result, Loblaw's shipments will resume, or did resume April 11th, fully in time for Easter. But the residue of this is key. Where do you go from there? How do you build or rebuild a relationship? Now, it's just not unique, by the way, to the retail business or any one industry. Construction business also had some challenges in which they had to deal with and had to take a different look at how they would solve that crisis. In the previous mentioned Don Tierra article from SIG, beyond transparency and technology, there are mechanisms within a contract that can help to mitigate the impact of inflation. The key is is how you use them or how you structure the contract. Now, remember, we're not looking to structure an adversarial feet to the fire contract here, because that's no different than what Walmart did with Vlasic Pickles. Let's look at the construction industry for just a second. Cost for materials, as you all know, I mean, we saw the news about lumber prices rising, et cetera, increased from 15 to 50%, 15 to 50%. And companies, contractors experience huge losses on projects because it was a fixed price contract. And you know what a fixed price contract is. So for the sake of expedience, I'll not go into the detail of that. But many builders incorporate in response to those fixed price contracts, factoring escalation clauses. Now, you know, it did address the risk somewhat. However, it came with its own negative consequences, or as they referred to in the article, inherent drawbacks. While cost escalation clauses are illegal in some jurisdictions, so you can't even do that, they ultimately, and this is interesting, the extended impact is they undermine the ability to get financing. So in other words, is the contract an opportunity to create harmony and bring something together and work together? Or is it, again, weaponized, for lack of a better word, to try to get one party to hold something over the other party? A better option, it was suggested, was to focus on their fixed expenses. In other words, we know we're going to run into delays. We know we're going to run into cost issues. So let's shift our financial model to project net versus gross profits. Let's open up the door. Let's work towards a more transparent environment where both stakeholders, all stakeholders, come together and have a benefit or a gain. Now, that's an important consideration. But is it possible? Has it been done? Up until this point in time, with these examples we've given, we've all seen these ways of operating. They become what you can call almost an inherent trait of how we do business, at least how some companies still do business. So how do you build a bridge? How do you build that bridge of communication? And in this compelling story, and it resonates with me to this day, I'm going to talk about the I-35 West bridge collapse. Now, one of the things is interesting, and I'll repeat this at the end of this section. My question has always been, can procurement collaborate and innovate outside of a crisis situation? That's the first step. Could we do that outside of a situation? Even more importantly, using this as a reference point, which was a crisis situation, how can we use it as a foundation or framework? Okay, so let's look at this. The I-35 West Bridge collapsed on August 1st, 2007. It was a main artery in Minnesota between the Twin Cities, and it trapped more than 100 vehicles. It also, based upon Janny Catania's Forbes article, 13 people died and 145 were injured. Now, within 18 hours of the collapse, the governor mobilized the TAC team and challenged the Minnesota Department of Transportation to complete a replacement bridge within 18 months. Now, I want you to take your time, just think about that for a moment. 18 months to build a bridge. And they were looking at doing it not only in a shortened timeline, they were doing it to honor the people who had died because they needed that. They also looked at it to restore a vital infrastructure or artery into and out of the cities or between the cities. And they had to employ an architectural approach that wasn't normally or hadn't previously been used. You had to do it in 18 months. Now, here's the thing, and I'm sure if you have experience in this area, and even if not as this complicated of a procurement, you have had complex procurement requirements. It typically takes about 18 months, that long, just to put together a scope of work, let alone complete a project. And that was an interesting observation. So how do you get an organization, a government entity, a bid-oriented organization, to be able to achieve the results quickly, affordably, reliably? Well, what they did is they established all parties, established what's known as business agreements amongst each other, where they had a vested, I want you to emphasize that word, vested interest in each other's businesses. Important point to make here. In other words, they agreed, we're going to abandon our normal bid process for a project like this. We're going to open up the books, we're going to share the risk, and we're going to work together as a partnership towards achieving the result. In other words, they moved from what the article reports as low price and design bid build to progressive best value, the design build approach. Now, to establish a strategic value network, how do you get to that point? And one of the things I was asked during the interview is you have to look beyond the transactional mindset and adopt a relational approach. And that transactional mindset is usually built on mistrust. It's usually built on bottom line dollars. It is not built on open book frameworks. And I mean, I've got a lot of case studies I can talk about shortly in terms of what the other downfalls of those are. But the reality is a relational approach takes a transparent and shared risk approach to completing a project, to successfully implementing a procurement strategy or plan. And what they look at it from the standpoint of, if all of us don't benefit from it, then none of us will benefit from it. So I want you to keep that in mind. Why? Because the bridge was built astonishingly, as they say, and finalized before the scheduled time period, on time, on budget. I wanted to digress here for a moment, because on the next bridge project, and I followed this story up, they reverted back to the old way of doing business, and that bridge ran over budget and over time. So which way works better? And see, this is laying down the foundation, if you'll excuse me for using that construction term, but it's laying down the foundation for building a relationship business with your suppliers. And that's really the key there. That's moving and transitioning from an adversarial to a cooperative and collaborative approach. Now, there's been a lot, and if you've been on the social media networks or followed me on LinkedIn, you'll see a lot of great people talking about the importance of collaboration, and they talk about education and the tools that are available. I'll tell you, those are very important. The education and the curriculums to learn how to collaborate, and the tools that facilitate that with faster and more reliable provision of information, reliable, actionable knowledge, as I'll call it. However, those benefits and capabilities are significantly muted when there is a lack of will to collaborate. And we're talking about a will to collaborate, a willingness to be open, and that starts at the top. So when you look at building a bridge, and I'll go back to that original question, can collaborations such as the I-35 West Bridge between buyer and suppliers, can it happen outside of a crisis? And certainly, when we're looking at the example of Lay's and Loblaws, and we're looking at many, many others, we'd have to think, the COVID-19 is a crisis. But unlike the bridge collapse, which was what we would call an acute crisis, the COVID is a lingering crisis. In fact, I would be very comfortable in saying that the COVID pandemic has forever altered the way supply chains work. And in fact, talking with somebody last week in a panel discussion, they said we shouldn't even call it supply chains anymore. We should call it supply networks. And when you talk about networks, you should talk about networking. And what is the basis of that? Collaboration, cooperation. One final thing. 2 years ago, I posted a question on LinkedIn asking this very question. And to tell you and demonstrate how hot of a topic it was, I almost had more than 93,000 views, a great number of comments, very interesting comments, and literally activity and feedback from people in terms of this. This is still an issue. So even after the pandemic happened, and I was asking this before, we're still now in the position of saying, how do we collaborate better? How do we improve that? Anyway, there's the link and the access to the LinkedIn post that I had done back then. You're welcome to use it and maybe even share your own thoughts on it. Because obviously, even though it's 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, it is obviously still a prevalent and timely conversation. So let's talk about the win-win. How do you get to that stage of win-win if it isn't a crisis standpoint? I'm going to talk about Facebook momentarily, but one of the things about win-win that's always concerned me is it's been a little bit of a punchline. We all talk a good game, but do we really walk a good game? And that's really the key here of what I want to start delving down into deeper. You see, what we started with the Loblaws and the Lay's, Frito-Lay example was during a crisis, post-crisis scenario, there is still an adversarial mindset that is existing and prevalent in our industry. That still exists. That hasn't changed. We've seen it going back to the days of the Walmart and Vlasic pickles. And by no means am I picking on Walmart or choosing sides on this thing and making somebody a good guy and somebody a bad guy, so to speak. But it's the nature of what procurement has been. I want to emphasize that term. What we're looking at now is what it could and should be. And that's the way we should view win-win. So when we saw the I-35 bridge, what it did is created the possibility that, yes, we could go outside of the normal operational protocol. We could go outside the framework of familiarity and do business on an open book, transparent basis. Now, how's that done? Well, listen, over the past 40 years, I've been in high tech and almost as long as in procurement, and I've seen a great deal of evolution. It's been gradual. Some would even suggest it's glacial. But the reality is I've seen a great deal of procurement professionals who have started to view suppliers as partners. You know, I referred to Tim Cummings and his reference about people sitting around the table often lie to each other about what they can do, by when they can do it, for how much they can do it. Kate Batasic, you know, that stays with me with what Tim said. And Kate Batasic, who wrote the book, and by the way, who was the person I learned about the I-35 West Bridge collapse, wrote the book, Gating to We, talks about the importance of, well, I'll say it again, getting to we. And I wrote this article. It's a reference article. In fact, you'll see at the bottom of slides, I do provide references to these articles. What makes a good negotiator? I asked the question. And this was a recent article, 2022. Well, let's talk about a true win-win. And let's use the pandemic for an example. Let's use the pandemic as our overall big case study. For all its negative impact, what it's done, though, is it's taught people and organizations, some, to take what's known as a partnership approach with suppliers, while others were looking at preserving cash flow, would go to their suppliers and say, we need extended terms, and not consider the extended and unintended consequences of that rippling through their supply networks. Because let's face it, if the buying company is in a cash flow situation and has slow payments, don't you think it's going to have an impact on a supplier, especially if said supplier is a small, medium enterprise, especially when it comes down to things like tailspin. Now, again, I don't want to differentiate between tailspin and the large complex deals, but the reality is you need to bring a relationship into both of those scenarios. And innovative CPOs offered to pay their suppliers sooner, faster, for a discounted rate. I mean, think about that. They looked at their supply network and they said, look, rather than put more cash pressure on you, rather than do that, what we're going to do is we're going to pay you early. We'll get a discount from you. You'll have cash that you'll need. We'll have a discount. It'll be a win-win scenario. See, that's win-win, because both organizations, both stakeholders come away with something that helps them to get through a difficult period. And it shouldn't be just reserved for when there's a difficult period. We shouldn't allow crisis to be our motivator, but smart business to be our motivator. Now, true win-win is that if you look at it, advanced payment to outstanding invoices, and I'm going to talk about Facebook. I was talking with their senior executive from their organization who indicated that during the pandemic, especially during the earlier days with their diverse suppliers, they not only offered to pay early, but they also realized that cash crunches could still result from the suppliers, other companies, customers, the buyers who they dealt with from other organizations. So Facebook actually funded their receivables across the board. And when I say across the board to varying degrees, what they did is they paid them for invoices that were owed by other companies, other buying companies. Now, that is really something that got my attention. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is something that organizations or all organizations should do. But what I'm talking about is the spirit that all organizations should bring to their supplier relationships. Now, I'm going to ask you this. Which of the above actions, if you were a supplier, would prompt you, would foster you to be more loyal and cooperative? Which will help you as a supplier, if you were a supplier, to say, I'm going to deal with these people, the one who puts me on 90-day terms and makes a difficult situation worse, or the one who's actually working collaboratively with me throughout this difficult time period? That's the key of collaboration. And I want to digress in 1 minute to give you another case example. A few years ago, the auto industry did a study. And I want to share this with you because it goes outside of the crisis period and goes back to that regular time period, just like the Walmart and Classic Pickles deal. The automotive industry did a study and a survey of suppliers. And they found that one of the biggest beefs against buying companies, the manufacturers, was slow payment. Slow payment. Think about that for just a second there. It wasn't during a crisis. They just didn't pay fast. What they discovered is that the manufacturers who paid on time, paid quicker, received better service and ultimately produced a better product. This was a study that was done a few years ago. So if you look at it, realistically speaking, if you're only measuring the value or success of your relationship on a balance sheet rather than the entire picture, you're ultimately going to run into problems in other unanticipated areas. Because let's face it, and this is what the pandemic has taught us, it taught us that supply chain procurement touches all areas of everyday life. There isn't one product out there. When you go to the pump to buy gas, when you go to your grocery store to buy groceries, when you order the bike, the exercise bike during the height of the pandemic when everyone was in lockdown, that all depends on supply chain, and nothing has changed there. If anything, we are now more acutely aware of how much purchasing, procurement, and supply chain impacts our daily lives. And that's why this is so important, that we take on a relational versus adversarial mindset. Now, going forward, who are the best negotiators? I was asked this once, and that's what prompted me to write the article. The best negotiators are ultimately not the ones who get what they just, the old saying and the caress saying, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. The best negotiators are ultimately going to be the best collaborators and the ability to work with someone. And I think that's really the key point here in what we're talking about. Now, I want to close off in the last couple of minutes by saying, if you look at each of these examples, you look at the Lays, the Frito-Lay and the Loblaw, you look at the Walmart and Vlasic Pickles, you look at what happened with regards to the I-35 West Bridge rebuild, what Facebook did and what other organizations have done, you're going to see that what's happened now, this crisis, this extended crisis, we'll call it, has changed the landscape. And we can no longer look at it and saying being relational or working on a collaborative basis or managing our supply base on an adversarial basis. It's not optional. We have to manage our organizations because we have to manage our relationships. And the better we manage our relationships, the more successful our organization will be. Not just now complying to ESG, which is a big thing for everyone, not just in terms of limiting the impact of supply chain disruption, and of course, creating an agile supply chain that can adapt easily, but we're laying down the foundation for a new way of doing business. That's really an old way. And it's based upon the approach of saying that when you gain, your partners gain. And when your partners gain, you gain. Anyway, thank you for this time. I enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you. I'm sure I couldn't take any questions from you, but as I mentioned, as you can see here, here's my email address and blog site. I would encourage you to give me a call, and I'm very happy to share whatever research material or content relative to today's post with you. But again, thank you, and thank you to eWorld for making this possible.